The rain was hitting the old wooden windows when Margaret heard the knock that would change her life forever. She already knew who was standing outside. For weeks, she had been trying to avoid them. But there they were. Two men in expensive suits stood on her porch holding a legal notice. Behind them was a black luxury car, and inside it sat the man who had been trying to take her home. Richard Cole, the billionaire businessman who owned half the town. The man everyone respected. The man who had built his empire by crushing people who were too weak to fight back. Margaret slowly opened the door. "Mrs. Hayes," one of the men said coldly, "this is your final notice. You have 7 days to vacate the property." Margaret looked down at the paper. Her hands started shaking. "This house belonged to my husband," she whispered. The man looked at her without emotion. "Your husband is gone. The paperwork is clear. The debt belongs to you now." Margaret looked back at the small house behind her. The house where she had raised her children. The house where she and Daniel had spent 30 years building a life together. Every wall carried a memory. Every room carried a piece of the man she lost. And now a stranger wanted to erase all of it. "I don't understand," Margaret said. "Daniel paid everything." The lawyer gave a small smile. Maybe he thought he did. Then he turned around. 7 days, Mrs. Hayes." The car door opened. Richard Cole stepped out. He was wearing a perfect suit, an expensive watch, and the confidence of a man who had never heard the word no. He walked toward Margaret slowly. "I'm sorry it had to happen this way," he said. But his voice did not sound sorry. Margaret stared at him. "You're taking my home." Richard looked around the property. "This land is worth millions now. Progress is coming. This little house has no place here anymore." Margaret's eyes filled with anger. "This house was here before your company." Richard smiled. "And now my company owns it." Those words stayed with her. Not because they were cruel, because they sounded too certain. Like he already knew she had lost. Richard returned to his car. "Don't make this difficult," he said. The car disappeared down the road, and Margaret stood there alone, holding the paper that could destroy everything. But Richard Cole didn't know one thing. Daniel Hayes had spent his entire life preparing for a moment like this, and he had left something behind, something Richard never found. 3 days later, Margaret sat alone at the kitchen table. The house was silent, too silent. Daniel used to sit across from her every morning drinking coffee. He used to joke that the old house would outlive them both. She smiled sadly. Then she noticed something, a small mark underneath the table. A mark Daniel had carved years ago. A tiny circle with an arrow. Margaret frowned. She had never seen it before. She reached underneath. Her fingers touched something hidden. A small wooden compartment. Her heart started racing. Inside was an old envelope. Yellowed, dusty, and written on the front were 4 words. "For Margaret, if they come." Her breathing stopped. Daniel knew. Somehow, Daniel knew someone would try to take this house. With trembling hands, she opened it. Inside was a letter. "Margaret, if you're reading this, it means Richard Cole finally came for the property. I need you to find someone you trust. Do not fight him alone. The truth about him is hidden in the documents I kept. He didn't build his empire honestly. He stole it." Margaret froze. Her husband had always been quiet. A simple man. He repaired machines at a factory for 40 years. Everyone thought he was just an ordinary worker. But this letter suggested something else. Something much bigger. At the bottom was one name. A lawyer. Thomas Reed. The next morning, Margaret found Thomas Reed. He worked in a small office on the edge of town. Not the kind of office Richard Cole used. No marble floors. No expensive furniture. Just a man surrounded by old books and paperwork. When Margaret placed Daniel's letter on his desk, Thomas went silent. "Where did you get this?" Daniel hid it. Thomas picked up the letter carefully. Then he looked at Margaret. "Your husband trusted very few people." "What does it mean?" Thomas leaned back. "It means Daniel knew something about Richard Cole." Margaret swallowed. "Can you help me?" Thomas looked at the old woman sitting across from him. He saw fear, but he also saw something else. Determination. "I'll try." They spent the next 2 days searching through Daniel's old documents. Bills, contracts, receipts, old company records. At first, nothing seemed important, until Thomas found a folder hidden inside an old toolbox. a folder Daniel had kept for decades. The first page had a company name, Cole Industries. Thomas's expression changed. This can't be possible. Margaret looked at him. What? Thomas slowly turned the page. This shows Richard Cole didn't start his company. He stole it. Years earlier, Richard Cole had worked at a small manufacturing company, a company owned by Daniel's friend. The business was struggling. Richard convinced the owner to sign documents promising investment. But according to the records Daniel discovered, Richard secretly transferred ownership to himself. He forged signatures, created fake debts, and destroyed anyone who tried to expose him. Daniel had found the evidence. But before he could reveal everything, he died. Margaret covered her mouth. My husband knew? Thomas nodded. He was building a case. Why didn't he tell me? Thomas looked down. Because he knew Richard would come after you. Silence filled the room. Then Margaret whispered, he was protecting me. But Richard Cole was not waiting. He had already heard that Margaret was searching. That evening, a black car stopped outside her house. Richard stepped out. This time, he wasn't smiling. You should stop digging, he said. Margaret stood at her door. You're scared. Richard laughed. Scared? Of you? No. She looked directly into his eyes. Of what Daniel left behind. For the first time, Richard's confidence disappeared. Only for a second. But Margaret saw it. And Richard saw that she saw it. You have no idea who you're fighting, he said. Margaret replied quietly. No, you don't know who you're fighting. 3 days later, the entire town gathered at the courthouse. Richard Cole arrived expecting victory. His lawyers were expensive. His confidence was unshaken. Margaret walked in wearing the same simple coat she had owned for years. People whispered. They thought she had lost. They thought she was just an old widow fighting a billionaire. Then Thomas Reed stood up. I would like to submit new evidence. Richard's lawyer laughed. Objection. This is irrelevant. The judge looked at the documents. Then his expression changed. Let me see that. The courtroom became silent. Page after page. Signature after signature. Proof after proof. Richard Cole's entire empire was built on fraud. The judge looked at Richard. Mr. Cole, did you know about these documents? Richard said nothing. For the first time in years, the powerful man had no answer. Then Thomas revealed the final piece. A recording. Daniel's voice filled the courtroom. If you're hearing this, it means I'm gone. Richard Cole believes power belongs to those with money. But he is wrong. Power belongs to the truth. Richard's face turned pale. The courtroom watched as everything collapsed. The billionaire who had humiliated people for decades, the man who thought nobody could touch him, was finally exposed. Months later, Margaret stood outside her house. The old sign that once said for sale was gone. The house remained. The garden was repaired. The walls still carried memories. But now they carried something else. Justice. A young neighbor asked her, Are you going to sell someday? Margaret smiled. She looked at the house. Then she said, Some things are worth more than money. Inside the house, Daniel's old chair still sat by the window. And every morning, Margaret placed 2 cups of coffee on the table. One for herself, and one for the memory of the man who protected her until the very end. Because Richard Cole thought he could take everything from a woman who had nothing. But he never understood one thing. A person with nothing left to lose is sometimes the most powerful person in the room.